For over 60 years, this was the oldest cold case in America. A little girl vanished while selling mints, and the life-taker's identity was a complete mystery. The one clue that finally cracked this wide open was hidden in a jar for decades. You will not believe the shocking method they used to identify him without a body. Stay until the end to discover the heartbreaking reason this little girl trusted her attacker completely. Candace Rogers had a laugh that never seemed to arrive halfway. It lifted fully from her chest, the sound of small joy unbothered by the world that waited outside childhood's narrow window. In Spokane, where the winters could be blunt and the river ran dark beneath the bridges, that laughter had been something warm. People remembered that about her, even when everything else was clouded by time. The softness of her cheeks, the way she ran with her friends under the open sky, her campfire girl scarf tied too snugly because she had insisted she could do the knot herself. She was 9 years old enough to believe the world was kind, young enough to never imagine it could be anything else. Her parents, Carl and Elaine Rogers, had raised her with the trust of a neighborhood that felt familiar in every direction. The streets were lined with modest homes, families knew one another by name, and doors stayed unlocked through long afternoons. Children were allowed to roam because the world still seemed small, still felt contained. Candace, called Candy by nearly everyone, had a habit of waving to strangers when she walked, a gesture that made her parents shake their heads but smile anyway. They believed, as so many parents did then, that innocence was natural, that kindness would be met with kindness. They did not yet understand that childhood could be interrupted, that danger could move quietly just a street away. On the afternoon of the 6th of March, 1959, the air was just cool enough to hint at spring despite winter's grip not yet fully loosened. Candy carried with her a box of campfire mints, the kind she sold to neighbors and shop owners to raise money for outings and group trips. She had done it before, many times, and she had always returned before dinner. She walked out of the small house on West Spofford Avenue. She wore a ribbon that had begun to fray at the ends, promising her parents she would be home before dark. Her father told her to be careful. Her mother reminded her to watch the time, and Candy nodded, as sincerely as children do when the world still makes sense to them. But daylight began to thin, and the evening did not bring her home. At first, there was only unease, the kind that makes a parent search the windows and the road and tell themselves she must still be nearby. Minutes stretched, the streetlights flickered on, dinner cooled, the silence grew heavier, and then panic arrived all at once, as if it had always been waiting outside the door. Carl and Elaine reported her missing, voices tight with disbelief. The neighbors came first, flashlights in hand, calling her name. Then the officers, then the volunteers. Spokane became a landscape of searching bodies, moving through brush, alleys, riverbanks, roadside ditches. More than 1,000 people would walk those grounds in the days that followed, holding on to the hope that a child who had always returned home would return again. Somewhere in the search, night after night, the world began to feel too large. What had once been a familiar neighborhood seemed suddenly unknowable. People whispered, prayed, questioned, wondered how something could happen here to her, to a family like theirs. In a quiet city in eastern Washington, innocence cracked, and it cracked loudly. But the search did not only bring sorrow, it brought tragedy, layered upon tragedy. A helicopter sent by the U.S. Air Force to help comb the remote woodlands caught an unseen power line near the river and fell. Flames rose against the water. 3 crewmen died in the crash. 2 more survived with broken bodies. Even the sky, it seemed, was unwilling to reveal where Candy had gone. Time moved forward, though slowly, painfully, the way grief does when there is no answer. Leads came and faded. Footprints turned out to belong to other children. Sightings led nowhere. The world continued, as worlds do. But Carl and Elaine remained suspended in those days between her leaving and her not returning, caught in a kind of stillness that other people could step out of, but they could not. 2 weeks after she vanished, on March 21, 2 airmen hunting in the woods stumbled upon something too small, too delicate, and too wrong to be in that expanse of pine needles and rotting leaves. A pair of children's shoes. They brought the news back, uncertain but afraid they already knew. The next morning, a larger group returned, and within minutes, beneath a shallow scatter of branches and brush, they found her. This was where the world caved in. The air seemed to thin around the searchers. They stood frozen, unable to speak. There are moments in crime that silence entire landscapes, where even birds seem unwilling to make a sound. This was one. Candy's parents did not get to hope after that. No return, no small miracle, she was gone. The examination that followed was clinical, distant, the kind of procedure that officers and coroners try not to see emotionally, even as it tears at them. Forensic science in 1959 was primitive by comparison to what the world knows now. There was no DNA technology, no advanced profiling, but there were fibers, there were bruises. The city mourned, but mourning did not solve. Instead, an investigation began that would refuse to die, an investigation that would last not months, not years, but generations. Detectives followed every thread they could. There was a man known for behaving suspiciously, a wanderer whose crimes crossed states, who had once been known to chew grape-flavored gum, a detail that made investigators pause when a cap of the same scent was found near her body. But years later, when DNA finally existed, it would eliminate him entirely, proving that suspicion is not truth, and that sometimes evil is harder to name than the obvious suspect. Another man lived only a few blocks away and had been tied to disturbing behavior toward young women. Rope was found in his car, and he kept news clippings about harassment and assault. He kicked the bucket by himself before authorities could question him further. Still, nothing linked him concretely to Candy. A third suspect also kicked the bucket by himself when he was in custody, leaving a message written in blood, declaring guilt to God, but not specifying what sins he confessed. Investigators were left with only a suggestion, a ghost of responsibility, but no proof that tied him to the child whose name remained printed across police files and newspaper pages. And so the case went cold, but it did not go dormant. The Spokane Police Department did something almost unheard of. They carried Candy's case as a kind of inheritance. When officers retired, they did not simply file away the story. They told it to the new detectives, as if passing forward a memory that should never be allowed to fade. One generation of investigators handed it to the next, like a quiet vow: do not forget her. Do not let the world move on completely. And they did not. Time changed everything. The city, the landscape, the technology available to solve crimes. Children no longer walked alone the way Candy had. Parents watched more closely. Doors locked earlier. Spokane remained beautiful, but there was something woven into its memory now. Something that did not disappear even as the decades turned. Candy's parents would not live to see the end of the story. They died not knowing who had taken their daughter. They died with the question still open, still raw. But the detectives who inherited the case carried it forward. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because some losses imprint themselves on the bones of places. Because some justice refuses to be abandoned. In 2021, more than 60 years after Candy's life was taken, a forensic scientist examining preserved evidence suggested something unexpected. A private genome lab in Texas might be able to extract usable DNA from what had been stored in an airtight jar decades earlier. That jar, sealed carefully, perhaps even lovingly by an investigator who believed the world might someday know more than it did then, had saved the truth. Inside was a trace, a microscopic remnant of the body that had harmed Candy. And somehow, against the odds, it had survived time. The DNA was processed, mapped, and compared to genealogical databases that did not exist at the time of the crime. 3 brothers emerged as potential matches. One of them had children. One of those children, now an adult, agreed to provide a sample. When the result came back, it did not waver. The man who unalived Candy was named John Ray Hoff. He had lived less than a mile from her home. He had known her through his younger sister, who belonged to the same campfire group. He had been 20 years old in 1959, old enough to understand exactly what he was doing. After unaliving her, he lived for another 11 years. During that time, he did similar act to another lady. She survived. Hoff was arrested, served time, was discharged from the army. And then, at the age of 31, he kicked the bucket himself. His grave had rested in silence for decades before investigators returned with a warrant to confirm what the DNA had already said. They exhumed his remains. They tested them. The match was perfect. There was no mistake, no alternate explanation, no shadow of uncertainty left. The man who stole Candy's life was gone before the world could confront him. There would be no trial, no sentencing, no apology, no statement of remorse, no face-to-face reckoning. But there would be something else. there would be a name. For Candy's surviving cousin, Joanne, who had grown old carrying the memory of a girl frozen forever at 9 years old, the news arrived not as relief, but as a quiet settling. Not closure, because closure is impossible when the child you loved has been gone most of your life, but something like an exhale. A loosening of a question that had tightened around her family for more than half a century. She said, when asked, that it mattered simply to know that the man responsible had been named, that he could not hide in memory anymore. But she also said the truth that made the room fall still, that Candy's parents had died not knowing, and that this was the part that hurt the most. The detectives who solved the case did not celebrate. There are victories that are not triumphs, victories that arrived too late to comfort those who most needed them, but they felt the weight shift. They felt history release something it had been holding. Candy was no longer lost to time. She was remembered, and the truth was remembered with her. In Spokane, the river still moves, the seasons still turn, the neighborhoods still hold families and laughter. But somewhere in the quiet memory of the city, there is a place where a 9-year-old girl once walked with a box of mints and believed the world was safe. There is grief in that place, but there is also love. The love of parents who never stopped waiting, the love of detectives who refused to look away, the love of a cousin who kept speaking her name when the rest of the world moved forward, and love is a strange and powerful thing. It does not make tragedy smaller, but it insists that what was lost is not forgotten. Candace Rogers lived only 9 years, but she is remembered across more than 60. Not for the way she passed away, but for the way she lived. Joyful, open-hearted, believing in the goodness of the world. She deserved more time, but she is not lost anymore. Her story has been told, and it will not disappear. That is how a promise between detectives across generations finally gave a name to Candy's life-taker. Let me know which detail from this case you found the most shocking. Tell us if you believe justice was truly served since he was never arrested. Share this story so Candy is never forgotten. Follow for more videos on cold cases that were finally solved.